Trump's China Boeing announcement and Canada's Airbus AirAsia order are now being compared, because they show two very different futures for North American aerospace. For you, this is not just about airplanes. It is about jobs, factories, prices, trade power, and whether Canada and the United States still build together or start building around each other. Washington came home with a headline from Beijing, but Quebec walked away with a firm aircraft order, and that contrast is the real story. The proof is not in the political spin. It is in what was confirmed, what was missing, and what each country is trying to prove. President Trump said China had agreed to buy 200 Boeing jets after his talks in Beijing. He also said that number could eventually climb as high as 750 planes. On television, that sounded massive. It sounded like a major win for American manufacturing, American workers, American exporters, and Boeing. But aerospace does not run on television lines. It runs on signed contracts, named customers, aircraft types, delivery schedules, deposits, production slots, engines, parts, and years of planning. And when the Boeing news came out, the most important details were still not clear. The aircraft mix was not clear. The delivery timeline was not clear. The customer airlines were not clear. The final order status was not clear. Boeing did not immediately announce the order. That does not mean the announcement was fake. It does not mean the deal collapsed, but it does mean the headline was ahead of the paperwork. And in aerospace, that matters. Because when a president says 200 jets, regular people hear certainty. Investors hear questions. Are these new orders? Are they old commitments being counted again? Are they narrow-body aircraft? Are they wide-body aircraft? Are they tied to future negotiations? Are they firm purchases or political signals? When will they be delivered? Who is actually buying them? Those questions are why the market reaction was cautious. Boeing shares fell nearly 4% after the smaller than expected China figure was reported. And the reason is simple. Industry expectations had been much higher. Many people in the aerospace market had expected at least 500 narrow-body jets, possibly more, plus wide-body aircraft. So when Trump said 200, the number sounded huge to a political audience, but disappointing to some investors. That is the first crack in the story. A possible 200-plane Boeing order would still be important. If finalized, it could support American factory jobs, GE Aerospace engines, Boeing suppliers, export numbers, and the wider US industrial base. It could also help Boeing regain ground in China after years of tension, trade fights, safety concerns, and lost momentum. But the key phrase is if finalized, if the order is confirmed, if the planes are new, if the aircraft types are named, if the delivery schedule is real, if China follows through. If politics does not interrupt the deal before the first jet reaches the customer. That is a lot of ifs for an announcement that was presented like a finished victory. And that is where Canada enters the story. Only days before Trump's Boeing claim, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood behind a very different aerospace announcement in Quebec. Airbus and AirAsia reached an agreement for 150 Airbus A220-300 aircraft. These aircraft are to be assembled in Mirabel, Quebec. Canada described it as the largest Canadian designed and produced commercial aircraft order in its history. Canadian reporting said the first aircraft is expected in the first quarter of 2028. That is a different kind of announcement. The buyer is named. The aircraft is named. The assembly site is named. The delivery window is named. The industrial message is clear. AirAsia is not a vague customer. The A220-300 is not a vague aircraft. Mirabel is not a vague factory. The order is not being sold only as a diplomatic headline. It is being sold as a manufacturing win for Quebec and a strategic win for Canada. And that is why this comparison hurts Washington. Because the American side is about whether Trump can turn pressure on China into Boeing sales. The Canadian side is about whether Canada can reduce dependence on the United States by building stronger ties with Europe and Southeast Asia. One side came with a claim. The other side came with a production line. One side was asking the market to wait for details. The other side was pointing directly at the workers who will build the planes. This is not just Boeing versus Airbus. This is leverage versus diversification. And for Canada, diversification is no longer just an economic slogan. It is becoming a national strategy. To understand why, you have to look at what happened before the Mirabel celebration. In January 2026, Trump threatened 50% tariffs on Canadian aircraft. He also threatened to decertify Bombardier Global Express jets during a fight involving claims about Gulfstream aircraft certification. Whether that threat could actually be carried out is a separate question. Aviation certification is normally a safety and regulatory issue, not a political weapon. But the threat itself was enough to send a message to Canada's aerospace industry. Your aircraft can be targeted. Your factories can be pressured. Your access to the US market can be threatened. Your strongest industries can become bargaining chips. That is why the AirAsia order matters so much. Canada was not just announcing plane sales. Canada was saying, we need options. We need customers beyond the United States. We need partners beyond Washington. We need aerospace growth that does not depend only on the political mood of the White House. Carney's government framed the A220 order as part of a bigger economic plan. Canada has talked about a goal of driving $1 trillion in investment over 5 years, building new economic and defense partnerships, and attracting nearly $100 billion in foreign investment commitments. That kind of language is not accidental. It is the language of a country trying to protect itself before the next trade fight arrives. And this is the part that makes the story much bigger than plane counts. Because if you only compare 200 Boeing jets to 150 Airbus jets, you miss the point. Yes, if Trump's Boeing order becomes final, it may be larger in value than the AirAsia deal. Some estimates have placed a possible 200-plane Boeing package in the $17 to $19 billion range, depending on the aircraft mix. The AirAsia A220 deal has been reported around $6.8 billion. So no, it is not accurate to say Carney automatically landed a bigger deal. But that is not the strongest argument. The stronger argument is this. Trump's Boeing announcement was politically powerful, but commercially under-detailed. Carney's A220 announcement was smaller by some measures, but more concrete in public terms. That difference matters, because one is trying to prove that American pressure works. The other is trying to prove that Canada has somewhere else to go. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream media explains the full picture, the moment to understand it may already have passed. Subscribe so you are always ahead of the story, not catching up to it. Boeing is not just another company. It is one of the great symbols of American industrial power. It represents commercial aviation, defense capability, advanced manufacturing, export strength, and thousands of skilled jobs across the United States. When foreign airlines buy Boeing aircraft, the benefits can spread through suppliers, engine makers, parts manufacturers, software firms, maintenance crews, and factory towns. That is why Trump wants the Boeing story to look like a victory. He wants American voters to see that his pressure on China produced results. He wants factory workers to hear that US manufacturing is winning. He wants investors to believe that tariffs and hard bargaining are bringing business back to America. But China knows how to use aircraft orders too. Beijing understands that buying Boeing can ease tension with Washington. It also understands that delaying Boeing orders can create pressure. China can split orders between Boeing and Airbus. It can support its own domestic aircraft industry. It can make announcements during diplomatic visits. It can use commercial aviation as part of a larger negotiation involving tariffs, technology, agriculture, energy, Taiwan, and rare earths. That is why vague details are not harmless. A real Boeing order can support American jobs. A vague promise supports a political headline first. Those are not the same thing. Canada's A220 story also has risks. This is not a fairy tale. Mirabel still has to deliver. Airbus Canada has faced production challenges. Supplier issues, engine constraints, and profitability questions have surrounded the A220 program for years. A firm order is not the same as 150 delivered aircraft. A delivery window is not the same as a completed production schedule. So the honest picture is this. The United States may have a major Boeing opening in China, but the public details still need to catch up. Canada has a concrete A220 order, but the factory still has to execute. That is the balanced view. But politically, the contrast is still powerful. Because Trump's pressure on Canadian aerospace helped create the exact argument Carney is now using. When Washington threatens tariffs on Canadian aircraft, Ottawa can stand in Mirabel and say, "This is why Canada needs new markets." When Washington talks about decertifying Canadian-made jets, Ottawa can say, "This is why Canada cannot rely only on the United States." When American politics turns Canadian industry into leverage, Canada can answer by finding customers outside the American system. That is what AirAsia represents. AirAsia is not an American airline. It is a Southeast Asian buyer. It points toward the Indo-Pacific, a region where air travel demand is expected to keep growing as more people fly, more cities connect, and low-cost carriers expand. For Canada, that matters because a Quebec-built aircraft is not waiting at the US border for approval. It is entering a global market where Canada wants more influence. The A220 itself also carries history. It began as Bombardier's C Series, a Canadian-designed aircraft that was ambitious, expensive, and politically difficult. It nearly broke the company that created it. Then Boeing challenged Bombardier in the United States, and the C Series became the center of a major trade dispute. Later, Airbus took control of the program and renamed it the A220. So when an A220 order is celebrated in Mirabel today, it carries the memory of that fight. Canada learned that even a strong aircraft can be vulnerable if the country behind it lacks enough market power. Canada learned that the US market is valuable, but also risky. Canada learned that a Canadian industrial champion can become a target in American politics. That is why the Mirabel order is not just about 150 aircraft. It is about Canada trying to turn a painful industrial history into global leverage. And that should matter to Americans too, because if US allies start building around American pressure instead of with American partnership, the United States may win short-term fights and lose long-term trust. A tariff can force a negotiation today, but it can also push partners to diversify tomorrow. A threat can create leverage today, but it can also make allies ask how much exposure they can safely keep. That is the strategic cost. America can still be the biggest market, the strongest military power, and the most important partner for Canada. But if the relationship feels unpredictable, Canadian leaders will build escape routes. They may still trade with the United States, but they will look harder at Europe. They will look harder at Asia. They will look harder at defense partnerships, energy partnerships, and aerospace customers who are not controlled by Washington politics. For Canadian viewers, that is the core issue. Canada cannot move its geography. The United States will always be the giant next door. But Canada can decide whether its most important industries live or die by access to one market. That is what Carney is trying to signal. Partnership with America, yes. Dependence on America, no. That difference is everything. Do you think Canada should keep repairing its relationship with Washington, or should it move faster toward Europe and the Indo-Pacific? And for Americans watching this, do you think tariffs are smart leverage, or do they damage trust with allies that the US still needs? Those questions matter because aerospace is not an isolated industry. Aircraft are civilian products, but they are also strategic products. They require advanced engineering, skilled labor, precision manufacturing, engines, software, electronics, and complex supply chains. A country that can build aircraft is not just selling transportation. It is proving that it can still build complicated machines at scale. That is why Boeing matters to America. That is why Airbus Canada matters to Quebec. That is why China cares about aircraft orders. That is why Europe cares about Airbus. And that is why Southeast Asia matters as a growth market. Airplanes have become industrial power with wings. For Trump, the best-case scenario is clear. China confirms the order. Boeing adds real aircraft to its backlog. The planes are delivered. American workers benefit. GE Aerospace benefits. Suppliers benefit. And Trump can say his hard line with Beijing produced real results. But the danger is also clear. If the order remains vague, shrinks, gets delayed, or turns out to include older commitments, the announcement starts to look politically inflated. The headline would still have made noise, but the industrial gain would be weaker than promised. For Carney, the best-case scenario is also clear. The AirAsia order moves smoothly through Mirabel. Airbus Canada increases production. Quebec workers get long-term work. Suppliers gain confidence. Canada can show that diversification is not theory. It is real. But Canada's danger is execution. If production delays continue, if suppliers struggle, if costs stay too high, or if deliveries slip, critics will say the announcement was stronger than the factory's ability to deliver. So both sides still have something to prove. Trump must prove that his Boeing headline becomes a real commercial order. Carney must prove that his A220 order becomes real aircraft delivered on time. And that is why this story will not be settled by speeches. It will be settled by production schedules. It will be settled by contracts. It will be settled by workers on assembly lines. It will be settled by whether airlines keep trusting the countries and companies behind the planes. The deeper issue is that North American trade trust is weakening. For decades, the US and Canada built together. Cars crossed the border in pieces before they became finished vehicles. Energy moved both ways. Aerospace suppliers worked across provinces and states. Defense industries overlapped. The relationship was not perfect, but the basic assumption was stable. The border was a line, not a wall. Now that assumption is under pressure. Tariffs make the border heavier. Certification threats make the border riskier. Political fights make investment harder. And companies that plan 10 or 20 years ahead do not like uncertainty. That is why the Boeing and Airbus stories belong together. Boeing's possible China order shows America trying to regain lost ground in a critical foreign market. Airbus's AirAsia order shows Canada trying to build growth outside the shadow of Washington. One is a comeback story that still needs confirmation. The other is a diversification story that still needs execution. Neither side has fully won yet, but both sides have revealed their strategy. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story. Because the surface version says Trump announced 200 Boeing jets and Carney celebrated 150 Airbus jets. The real version says Trump is trying to prove American pressure can still force major commercial wins from China, while Canada is trying to prove it can grow without being trapped by American pressure. That is the main tension, and it is not over. If Boeing's China order becomes firm, detailed, and larger over time, Trump will claim his strategy worked. If it stays vague or falls short, critics will call it a headline without enough substance. If the AirAsia A220 order moves smoothly through Mirabel, Carney will have one of the strongest examples yet of Canadian trade diversification. If production problems slow the program, the political win will face a factory test. The headline race is over, but the industrial test has barely started. And the next question is whether other US allies are watching Canada and quietly preparing the same strategy. In my next video, I am covering how Trump's tariff threats are pushing US allies toward new trade blocs, and what I found will change how you see this.